Okay, so for anyone who might not have read the book or seen the film or series yet, then this is just an abridged version of what happens. But now, in earnest, to the presentation proper. The British £10 note currently features Jane Austen on its reverse. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. It's a nice quote, but it was not said by Jane Austen, or at least not directly anyway. This is in fact from chapter 11 of Pride and Prejudice, her most famous book, but is actually uttered by a rather unlikable character, Miss Caroline Bingley. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book! When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. So it seems that for this particular character, reading and having books was probably more of a status symbol, something that merely makes you look good. So, no doubt, this little quote is an expression of irony that even Jane Austen herself would have been quite appreciative of. If there is a title to this presentation, then I guess this one is as good as any. The Allure of Jane Austen. And money is quite apt, for Austen's novels are not just attractive for us readers today, but are also a lucrative commodity for the world of television and cinema. Now, in chapter 26 of A Companion to the Victorian Novel, Marsh and Eliot say that between 1927 and 1995, 73% of Best Film Oscar winners were awarded to film adaptations, which, again, reinforces that idea of the lucrative aspects of these classic novels, such as Pride and Prejudice. And playing in the background here is one of those Best Picture Oscar winners. This is actually one of my favourite movie scenes from the 1963 film Tom Jones by Tony Richardson, which I'm sure you'll remember is an adaptation of the novel by Henry Fielding. This is actually a very good adaptation, and in my opinion, definitely worth a watch, whether you've read the book or not. After Pride and Prejudice in 1940, no other film adaptation of an Austen novel was made for theatrical release until 1995, Sue Peril. This is actually quite surprising in a way, and in many ways it seems to run contrary to the previous quote. Now, there were adaptations of Jane Austen's books, including Pride and Prejudice, but no big productions. The picture, by the way, is from the 1940 film with the adorable Greer Garson, and in my opinion Britain's finest actor, certainly with regards to Shakespeare adaptations, Sir Laurence Olivier, who was no stranger to big movie adaptations of popular novels. In the very same year, he starred in Hitchcock's adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's novel Rebecca, and played Heathcliff the year before in William Wyler's Wuthering Heights. And so, from 1940, we jump to the halcyon days of 1995. But before we get to those two, music. And the music was written by Carl Davis, who, as you might have guessed from the photo, also wrote the score for the 1981 British film adaptation of The French Lieutenant's Woman, whose screenplay was written by Harold Pinter. Of course, I'm talking about the 1995 TV series now of Pride and Prejudice. But anyway, an interesting career Carl Davis had. Born in 1936, same year that the book Gone with the Wind was published, incidentally, he's still going strong as well. Now, it was also interesting to find out that he had done the music for a lot of silent film restorations, most of which I've seen, but had not been aware of that contribution until now. Now, the screenplay was written by Andrew Davies, obviously no relation, although he was born in 1936 too, and he worked on a string of similar productions around this period, such as those that you see on your screen. The director, Simon Langton, was also no stranger to small screen adaptations, with Catherine Cookson's The Cinder Path the year before, and also Smiley's People, a very popular six-part miniseries based on the John le Carré spy novel of the same name. So it is really no wonder how this series became a success. Everyone involved clearly knew what they were doing. And finally, let's not forget about the actors, a very important ingredient for any successful adaptation. Well, Colin Firth had been around before this series, but this show really took his popularity and fame up a few notches, quickly becoming a household name on the back of this series, while Jennifer Ehle, though not to experience quite the same boost in fame, certainly wasn't a one-hit wonder either. In fact, I actually saw a film of hers just the other night. It was called Contagion, which was about some deadly virus that starts in Asia and spreads all over the world. A bit unrealistic, perhaps, but that's cinema for you. Joking aside, these two were able to appear together once more, with both starring in the 2010 Oscar-winning film The King's Speech. Now, the next part of the presentation was supposed to be the video clips segment, but unfortunately we'll just have to make do with movie stills instead. So I first wanted to play the music in the opening credits from the series, but really I don't want to get sued, so I won't risk it. But you'll probably recall how upbeat and lively it is. Busy is the word I would use, busy. It already shows us some perspective too. It shows us that this is a woman's world, okay, embroidery, sewing, lace, and all that. And the music matches perfectly the very first scene that we see of the Bennet family at Meryton. Now, landscape. The opening scene of the series shows Darcy and Bingley riding out to take a look at the prospect of buying Netherfield. This is now a classic and standard opening, and is the way that all the major buildings are introduced henceforth. The building is basically being framed by the director, and this is what is known as heritage shots. This is a bit of an old trick, though. In the mid-18th century, some decades prior to Jane Austen's publications, landscape paintings were beginning to come into vogue, with Thomas Gainsborough, an originator of the 18th century British landscape school. Also, later on, there was Turner, who was very much a contemporary of Jane Austen's, as well as John Constable. Now you can see why I've put these video clips in a picture frame. As you can see in some shots just how familiar they seem to appear and how reminiscent of landscape paintings they are, and also of Gainsborough's portraits. So here I was about to show one of the most famous scenes in the TV miniseries when we, the audience, as well as Elizabeth and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, arrive at Pemberley, the home of Mr. Darcy. I don't have it for the still image here because I wanted to give you the feeling of surprise and the majesty of Pemberley as it comes into view. This is the point of view shot. It guides our mood and situates us, the viewer, in the carriage looking at it with, or maybe as, Elizabeth. This is also known as the long shot for obvious reasons, which gives us an aesthetic sense of beauty. Sarah Cardwell says that these shots are not just establishing shots. They follow a certain convention. They are a source of the programme's effective power, and importantly, it encourages us to view the buildings as the characters do. So then I had a clip that continued from the opening scene of the first episode, which leads to Elizabeth looking out at the landscape from a hilltop and running down the road and back to the village and the house at Meryton. And then there's one brief moment on screen that, pausing the video, one can easily see what could be a painting by Constable. So it begs the question, is there more being adapted here than just a book? Is this not adapting paintings as well? Anyhow, perspective is very important in the next clip, where it is obvious that this is Elizabeth's story, as she looks through a window and seems to be a little separate from all the chaos and confusion going on inside the house. This is an excellent scene for showing the director's skill in adapting a novel. Even though he, the director, has 6 episodes to play with, he wastes no time, and in one seamless scene, with little to no meaningful dialogue, he perfectly portrays all the personas of the Bennet family in just a few seconds. It's really quite wonderfully done. The next scene, which is really our first proper scene with dialogue, also shows just how quickly the plot can get going. Perhaps this is mostly exposition from the opening page of the novel, but again it is all very cleverly done, with, please note, certain dialogue being given to other characters, such as Elizabeth saying that famous opening line about a husband being in want of a wife, thus further reinforcing, of course, the issue of narratorial perspective. I did perhaps include a few too many clips, but this last one was just to be played in the background without the sound. It's the first of the many generic ballroom scenes. These are known as interior heritage shots. So far I probably haven't said enough in this commentary on mood, but everything I have been showing so far has been setting a certain mood. These ballroom scenes are an integration of image and narrative. The dances can also offer a range of moods, from upbeat or relaxed to romantic, as well as contemplative. And they offer further examples of a favourable past being represented, which I'll come to later. What must next be mentioned, surely, is nostalgia. Now, I am quite interested in nostalgia. I even did a literary themed 3-part documentary last summer on the nostalgia surrounding Brexit, which you can find on my YouTube channel, and therefore I know just how complex a topic nostalgia can be. But anyhow, Cardwell says how these scenes reinforce an overall mood of nostalgia, which is true. And now another clip here, intended to be played silently in the background. This is actually the most famous scene from the whole series, when Mr. Darcy arrives home earlier than planned. He goes for a swim in the lake, and then comes back walking to the house, to the surprise and embarrassment of Elizabeth, who had just started to change her thoughts about Darcy and his earlier advancements. I can tell you with confidence that this is the most famous scene, because this was always the scene they would repeat on TV whenever they referred to this show in retrospect. It is important to note that this series was, or rather became, an actual cultural event. On the right, we have a front cover from a TV magazine that was always published by the BBC in-house. And this was 2 years later when they decided to rerun the series on the channel. Notice the headline, "He's back!" exclamation mark. And then only in smaller print does it say Darcy. They know that we know who he is. We all know just from this image that it's Darcy, even though it's actually just Colin Firth dressed up as Darcy. But "he's back" is symbolic of the cultural importance from 2 years prior. So, nostalgia. Pride and Prejudice attempts to satisfy a nostalgic yearning for the past. Cardwell. And Pride and Prejudice's place in the wider televisual context also determines its place in popular culture, distancing the programme from the traditional notions of elite literary culture. So this is really interesting that at this point, say by 1997 for example, we already have this story as a cultural item, now transferred to other media, in this case the medium of television, and it stands alone in that medium. It has sort of broken free from the shackles and confines of its 200 and odd pages. And just back to the notion of a TV event, I remember, for example, Twin Peaks was a fairly big event when I was a kid, and much later Game of Thrones. So Pride and Prejudice belongs in that category of memorable and major events in TV history. Which brings me to the final part of this presentation, which is on Austen mania. You'll remember the £10 note, how Austen and the time she set her novels in has a certain allure and attraction. This TV event we mentioned led to a phenomenon that went also far beyond just the TV world. Austen is also lucrative as a tourist attraction. Andrew Higson writes, "When Sense and Sensibility appeared in cinemas in 1995, it was the first English language adaptation with a period setting to do so for more than half a century." Right, so this reminds us of what we said earlier, that there had never been such a big attraction with Austen's novels before, not as there now was. And then Sue Parrell writes that suddenly 6 adaptations came out in a year or two. So it was a bit like some untapped gold mine just waiting to be found. And once producers saw the potential surrounding these novels, then everyone wanted a piece of the pie, so to speak. So these are the 6 adaptations she refers to. You might well have seen a few of these. So why Jane Austen? And also, why the 1990s? So first we have the nostalgia factor. Also, third on the list there is modernity and urbanism, perhaps. A bit complicated, but the way things were maybe changing and you want to hark back to the older days. I mean, things were changing a lot in the mid-90s. 1995 was the start of the dot-com bubble. And I remember you had Windows 95 and the first PCs to have an actual desktop background as opposed to just the basic command prompt and word processor screen. Also, there's this funny quote from Parrell's book, which is a slight citation over there because she is quoting another source. But anyway, that Austen was the Quentin Tarantino of the 90s, which is maybe just something I will leave you to think about and make your own minds up about. Okay. We've mentioned heritage films, yeah, and we've mentioned heritage shots. But also there are heritage sites that became suddenly must-see places despite the fact that they had been there quite happily and peacefully all along without much commotion or bother about them before. There's National Trust on the left, English heritage on the right, which my mother used to work for, and therefore she had a free pass or something like that to all the sites. So I remember as a child going around dozens of such places. And she even has a book published, which you can see in the middle, about heritage pubs in London. Also quoted in Perrell's book is this fact about Lyme Park, which was used for Pemberley in the series. And it had 800 visitors in the first week after the programme was shown on television, and yet only 86 in the same period in the previous year. So that's about 10 times the amount of visitors. Now, a place my parents would probably not want to go to because this looks rather touristy and maybe a bit cheap, or I don't know what, but this is in the city of Bath. And we also have the Jane Austen House Museum in Hampshire, where Jane Austen lived, and also the same county where my mother was born, whose name is also Jane, strangely enough. But anyway, also Chawton House, which has a library dedicated to female writers, but one can also visit this as part of the Jane Austen tourism experience if you wish. And there are also other small spots of interest which sort of opens the door to an entirely different type of literary tourism, which is visiting either real or fictional places. But in the case of this picture, a real place that was used as a scene in her fiction. So you can go actually to this site on the Jurassic coast in Devon, or is it, sorry, Dorset, I beg your pardon, another county. Well, I was born in Dorset, and you can see the steps where Louisa Musgrove fell in the company of Captain Wentworth in Austen's novel Persuasion. These steps are actually known also as Granny's Teeth. Fun fact. Now, later in this course, we will be exploring the adaptation of John Fowles's novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman, where there's a moment early in the book when Charles points out to his female companion Ernestina the probable spot where Louisa Musgrove fell. And I couldn't really just leave us on a slide that references two different novels to the one we're supposed to be discussing here. So I will leave you with these front covers of Marvel Comics from about a decade ago. I really like the idea of making this into a comic, which of course is another type of adaptation. And it also shows the continuing allure of Jane Austen to this day. Thank you.